Fidel Castro was many things to many people. To Cuban exiles in South Florida, he was a tyrant, an assassin, a demon who stole the property and the future of millions of people while shooting or imprisoning his opponents and plunging his country into third world poverty. To millions of Cubans on the island, he was a charismatic leader who brought education, health care, and the dignity of nation sharing to even the poorest and blackest of citizens. To leftists around the world, especially those resentful of U.S. power and influence, he was an inspiration.
What
they want is to bury injustice and the lack of opportunity.
To people who refused to take him seriously, he was a cartoon revolutionary with his fatigues and cigar and marathon speeches.
Everybody in the world knows that my speeches are not brief.
To every American president since the late 1950s, Fidel Castro was a thorn in the side. Eisenhower watched Castro's popular revolution quickly become a communist revolution. Kennedy bungled an invasion by Cuban exiles, tried to have Castro killed, and nearly went to war over Soviet missiles on the island. Johnson began bringing over flight after flight of Cubans unable to tolerate life under Castro. Nixon and Ford watched Castro's influence spread throughout Latin America and then to Angola. Carter couldn't, or wouldn't, stop a tidal wave of Cuban refugees and cast-offs from reaching South Florida from the port of Mariel. Reagan saw a communist collapse in Eastern Europe, but not on his southern doorstep. Bush signed the optimistically titled Cuba Democracy Act in an attempt to liberate the island by tightening the trade embargo. Clinton struggled with a second influx and was pressured into tightening the trade embargo even further after Castro's MiGs killed 4 Cuban Americans flying light planes for the exiled group Brothers to the Rescue. Even when he finally did release his grip on power, his occasional appearances kept him in the headlines, outlasting George W. Bush's presidency and living well into Barack Obama's. Through it all, Fidel Castro remained a player on the world stage and arguably the most significant person in South Florida's post-war history. In great measure, Greater Miami looks the way it does, eats the way it does, talks the way it does, and does business the way it does because of Fidel Castro's revolution and the waves of immigrants it sent to South Florida. Fidel Alejandro Castro Ruz, born in 1926 in Oriente Province, Cuba, in comfortable circumstances to a Spanish immigrant father and a Cuban mother. He was educated by Jesuits, played sports, went to the University of Havana, got into politics, got married for several years, got a law degree, then on July 26, 1953, got more than 30 of his comrades killed in an abortive raid on an army barracks. Castro went to jail for a while, then went abroad to Mexico or the United States, trying to build enthusiasm and trying to raise money for his revolution. On November 20th, 1955, Castro spoke to 1,000 Cuban exiles in Miami at the Flagler Theater, where students presented him with a huge Cuban flag. On December 2nd, 1956, Castro and about 80 followers arrived in Cuba secretly from Mexico aboard a boat named Granma. From their hideout in the Sierra Madre, they were able in just 2 years to capitalize on popular dissatisfaction with the regime of Fulgencio Batista, then ride victoriously into Havana and take over. The most significant American response came 27 months later in April 1961. The U.S. launches an abortive invasion of Cuba, withdrawing crucial air support and sending secretly trained exiles to death and imprisonment at the Bay of Pigs. Later, President Kennedy is presented with a Cuban flag at the Orange Bowl. He says he will return it when it flies over a free Cuba. The debacle at the Bay of Pigs becomes the defining act of martyrdom for Castro's enemies in Miami and the defining act of Yankee hostility for Castro's supporters on the island. In short order, Cuba becomes a close ally of the Soviet Union, reaping economic rewards during the Soviets' heyday and falling into economic ruin after the Soviets' collapse. The huge public rallies become smaller and less frequent. Castro's bombast becomes somewhat muted. Gasoline becomes scarce, blackouts become common, Cubans become pessimistic. And when Cubans get pessimistic, many of them head for the United States. Finally, under pressure, Fidel, the inflexible revolutionary, began bending a bit, legalizing the ownership of dollars, permitting some foreign investment, mostly in tourism, putting on a blue suit and chatting up business people in New York, loosening restrictions on the church, even during his 71st year meeting with the Pope. But even as his dark gray beard gave itself up to gray, the man whose credo was socialism or death would not give up any of his power. Neighborhood enforcers kept dissenters from organizing. Castro kept insisting political reform was unnecessary. Year kept stubbornly following year. His aging enemies stubbornly kept imagining scenarios for his downfall. And still the stubborn old revolutionary refused to go away. Many of the enemies he hadn't shot or imprisoned, he managed to outlive. History's judgment? It will no doubt fall somewhere between the judgment of his worshippers and the judgment of his enemies. There also is no doubt that Fidel Castro leaves a deep, deep footprint on the island of Cuba, on southern Florida, and on the post-war politics and policy of the United States of America.